5 hyenas circled the pregnant bobcat and the tiny kitten she refused to abandon, their teeth bared for an easy kill. The bobcat's choice to stand and fight when every instinct screamed to flee would expose a mystery about maternal love that defied everything wildlife experts believed possible. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The Arizona desert has a way of keeping secrets, burying them beneath layers of sand and stone where only the wind knows their stories. But on a scorching afternoon in late June, when the temperature climbed past 108 degrees, one secret was about to reveal itself in the most unexpected way. A pregnant bobcat, heavy with unborn kittens and driven by instincts older than the mountains themselves, stood between a tiny domestic kitten and 5 hungry coyotes. What happened next would challenge everything wildlife experts thought they knew about maternal instinct and interspecies behavior. The heat shimmered across the desert floor like liquid glass, distorting the landscape into wavering mirages that played tricks on anyone foolish enough to venture out during the brutal midday hours. The Sonoran Desert stretched endlessly in all directions, its harsh beauty punctuated by towering saguaro cacti and scattered creosote bushes that somehow thrived in conditions that would kill most living things. It was in this unforgiving wilderness, 20 miles northeast of Tucson, that Dr. Elena Martinez had established her remote research station. At 42, Elena had spent nearly half her life studying the behavioral patterns of desert predators, particularly the elusive bobcat populations that called this harsh landscape home. Her weathered research station, little more than a reinforced trailer surrounded by solar panels and weather monitoring equipment, sat perched on a ridge overlooking a broad valley where several wildlife trails converged. The location was perfect for observation, offering clear sightlines across the desert floor where animals moved between water sources and hunting grounds. Elena wiped sweat from her forehead as she reviewed the footage from her network of motion-activated cameras, each one strategically placed to capture the secret lives of the desert's most reclusive inhabitants. Her dark hair, streaked with premature gray from years under the intense desert sun, was pulled back in a practical braid. Deep lines framed her eyes, carved not by age but by countless hours squinting through binoculars and camera lenses. She had been tracking a particular female bobcat for the past 6 months, a magnificent specimen she had designated as Subject FB-17, though in her private notes she called her Sierra. Sierra was special. At approximately 5 years old, she was in her prime, weighing around 28 pounds with a coat that displayed the classic rufous coloring and black spots that made bobcats such stunning creatures. But what made Sierra truly remarkable was her behavior. Unlike most bobcats, who maintained strictly solitary territories except during mating season, Sierra had demonstrated unusual tolerance for the presence of other animals, including a young male bobcat Elena suspected might be her offspring from a previous litter. The morning had started routinely enough. Elena had been reviewing overnight footage when she noticed Sierra moving through her territory with the distinctive gait of a pregnant female. The bobcat's belly was visibly distended, and her movements had taken on the careful deliberation of an animal carrying precious cargo. Based on Elena's calculations, Sierra was likely 3 to 4 weeks away from giving birth, probably to a litter of 2 or 3 kittens. Bobcat gestation periods typically ran around 60 to 70 days, and Sierra had been observed mating in early April. Elena had just poured herself a 3rd cup of coffee, grimacing at its bitter taste, when movement on one of her live monitors caught her attention. Camera 7, positioned near an outcropping of rocks that created natural shade and shelter, had activated. What appeared on the screen made Elena lean forward, her coffee forgotten. Sierra was there, as expected, but she wasn't alone. Huddled against the rocks, looking impossibly small and out of place in the harsh desert landscape, was a domestic kitten. The little cat couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old, its white and orange calico fur standing out starkly against the tawny desert colors. It was crying, the soundless mews visible in the way its tiny mouth opened repeatedly. The kitten's fur was matted with dust, and even through the camera's lens, Elena could see it was severely dehydrated. How a domestic kitten had ended up alone in the middle of the Sonoran Desert was a mystery, but one thing was immediately clear. Without intervention, it wouldn't survive another day in this heat. But what captured Elena's attention and held it wasn't the presence of the doomed kitten. It was Sierra's behavior. The pregnant bobcat hadn't killed the kitten on sight, which would have been the expected response. Instead, she was circling it, her body language suggesting neither predatory intent nor fear. She was investigating, her nose twitching as she processed the strange creature's scent. The kitten, whether from exhaustion or some instinctive recognition that this larger cat might be its only hope, had stopped crying and simply sat there, its blue eyes fixed on Sierra. Elena grabbed her field journal, her hands moving automatically to record the observation, even as her mind raced through possible explanations. Cross-species maternal behavior wasn't unheard of in captivity, but in the wild, particularly between a pregnant predator and what should have been prey, it was extraordinarily rare. She glanced at the temperature readout on her weather station, 109 degrees. The kitten wouldn't last until sunset. The decision formed quickly. Elena had always maintained strict protocols about interfering with natural processes, but this wasn't a natural situation. A domestic animal had somehow ended up in wild territory, and while she couldn't save every creature the desert claimed, she also couldn't simply watch a kitten die of exposure when intervention was possible. She began gathering supplies: water, a pet carrier she kept for emergency wildlife rescues, protective gloves, and her tranquilizer kit in case Sierra proved aggressive about defending her space. She was halfway to the door when the live monitor chimed again, this time with an urgency that made her stop and look. Multiple cameras had activated simultaneously, their overlapping fields of view painting a picture that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. 5 coyotes were moving through the valley, their path taking them directly toward the rock outcropping where Sierra and the kitten waited. The coyotes moved with the practiced efficiency of a hunting pack, their lean bodies rippling with muscle beneath coats bleached pale by the desert sun. Coyotes and bobcats typically avoided direct confrontation, each species recognizing the other as a capable predator. But a pack of 5 coyotes would have numerical advantage over a single bobcat, and a pregnant one at that. The situation had just transformed from a rescue mission into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. Elena watched, frozen, as the lead coyote, a large male with a distinctive scar across his muzzle, caught the scent of something interesting and changed direction, moving with sudden purpose toward the rocks. What happened next unfolded with the strange clarity that comes in moments of extreme tension, when time seems to simultaneously speed up and slow down. Sierra's ears swiveled forward, detecting the approaching threat a full 30 seconds before the coyotes came into view. Her body language shifted instantly from curious to defensive, every muscle tensing beneath her spotted coat. The pregnant bobcat positioned herself between the kitten and the direction of the approaching predators, her stub of a tail twitching with agitation. Elena watched through the monitor, her heart hammering against her ribs, as she realized she was about to witness something that might never be documented again. The kitten, sensing the change in Sierra's demeanor, pressed itself even closer to the rocks, making itself as small as possible. Its survival instincts, though designed for a world of warm houses and food bowls, recognized predatory danger when it materialized. The little calico's eyes went wide, its ears flattening against its skull, as the first coyote emerged from behind a cluster of Palo Verde trees. The lead coyote, the scarred male Elena had observed on previous occasions, stopped about 40 feet from the rocks. His packmates fanned out behind him in a loose semicircle, their formation speaking to years of coordinated hunting experience. Helena had documented this particular pack for over a year, watching them bring down jackrabbits, ground squirrels, and even an injured javelina. She knew their tactics, their hierarchy, their ruthless efficiency. 5 against 1, even if that one was a bobcat, should have been a foregone conclusion. But the scarred male hesitated, his nose lifted, testing the air, and Elena could almost see the calculations running through his predatory mind. Bobcats were formidable opponents, all claws and teeth and fearless aggression when cornered. A pregnant bobcat, however, would typically retreat rather than risk injury that could compromise her unborn kittens. The coyote's experience told him this should be an easy intimidation, a simple matter of forcing the bobcat to abandon whatever had caught her interest. Sierra had different plans. As the coyotes began their approach, moving with deliberate slowness designed to pressure her into fleeing, the bobcat did something that made Elena gasp aloud. Instead of retreating, Sierra advanced. She moved 3 steps forward, placing herself in a position where the coyotes would have to go through her to reach the kitten. Her mouth opened in a silent snarl, displaying teeth designed for tearing flesh. The black tufts on her ears stood erect, making her appear larger, more threatening. The coyotes paused. This wasn't the response they had anticipated. The scarred male glanced back at his packmates, a moment of uncertainty passing between them. In the complex language of predators, Sierra was broadcasting a message that transcended species. She would fight, she would not run, and anyone who pushed this confrontation would pay a price in blood and pain. Elena's mind raced as she watched the standoff develop. Everything in her training told her that Sierra should retreat. Pregnant females of any species prioritized the survival of their unborn offspring above all else. Fighting a pack of 5 coyotes risked not just injury, but death. The logical choice, the evolutionary imperative, was to abandon the kitten and escape to safety. But Sierra wasn't moving. Her paws remained planted, her body coiled like a spring, ready to explode into violence if the coyotes took one more step. 2 of the younger coyotes, emboldened by their numbers, began to circle wide, attempting to flank Sierra's position. It was a standard tactic, one that had served the pack well in previous hunts, but Sierra tracked their movement without shifting her primary focus from the lead male. Her head turned slightly, keeping both flanking coyotes in her peripheral vision while maintaining her aggressive posture toward the main threat. The scarred male made his decision. He lunged forward, not a full attack, but a testing charge designed to break Sierra's nerve. Most animals would bolt at such a display, their flight instinct overriding any thoughts of standing ground. Sierra's response was instantaneous and shocking. She launched herself forward to meet the charge, covering the distance between them in 2 powerful bounds. Her right paw, claws extended to their full lethal length, slashed through the air, where the coyote's face had been a fraction of a second earlier. The coyote jerked backward, surprised by the ferocity of the counterattack. A thin line of red appeared on his muzzle just above the old scar, where one of Sierra's claws had found its mark. It was a superficial wound, nothing that would slow him down, but its message was clear and unmistakable. Sierra wasn't bluffing. She was prepared to die on this spot rather than yield. Elena grabbed her emergency radio, her protocols about non-interference crumbling in the face of what she was witnessing. She needed backup, needed someone else to document this, to verify that she wasn't imagining what was unfolding on her monitors. But even as her fingers found the radio's power button, she couldn't take her eyes from the screen. The flanking coyotes had frozen, their advance halted by Sierra's explosive response to their leader. The scarred male was reassessing, his body language showing confusion. This wasn't how confrontations with bobcats typically played out. Even the most aggressive bobcat would give ground when faced with overwhelming numbers, but this female, heavy with kittens and facing impossible odds, was instead escalating the conflict. Behind Sierra, the domestic kitten remained pressed against the rocks, its tiny body trembling. It seemed to understand, with whatever limited comprehension its young mind possessed, that the spotted cat standing between it and certain death was fighting for its life. The kitten's blue eyes, still showing the cloudiness of youth, tracked the movements of the coyotes with instinctive fear. The standoff stretched into its third minute, each second feeling like an hour to Elena as she watched from her distant vantage point. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, heat waves rising from the sand to distort the scene like a fever dream. The temperature was approaching 110 degrees, and both bobcat and coyotes were beginning to show signs of stress from the exposure. Panting tongues, flattened ears seeking any hint of breeze, bodies that wanted nothing more than to retreat to shade and water. It was the scarred male who finally made the calculation that saved them all. The small prey item behind the bobcat, whatever it was, wasn't worth the cost this fight would demand. Already injured, facing an opponent who had demonstrated willingness to inflict serious harm, he made the decision that survival often requires. He backed down, his head lowered slightly, not in submission but in acknowledgement. The fight wasn't worth the prize. The other coyotes, reading their leader's body language, began to retreat. They moved slowly, maintaining their formation, unwilling to show weakness by fleeing outright. Within 30 seconds, they had melted back into the desert landscape, disappearing behind rocks and vegetation as if they had never been there. Only the small drops of blood in the sand, already being absorbed by the thirsty earth, remained as evidence of the confrontation. Sierra held her aggressive posture for another full minute, ensuring the coyotes were truly gone. Her sides heaved with exertion, her body trembling slightly from the adrenaline surge that had fueled her defense. Slowly, gradually, she relaxed. Her ears, which had been pinned flat during the confrontation, rotated forward again. Her tail stopped its agitated twitching. She turned, finally, to look at the kitten that had nearly cost her everything. Elena watched, hardly daring to breathe, as Sierra approached the kitten with slow, deliberate movements. The bobcat's ears remained forward, alert for any returning threat, but her body language had shifted from aggressive to something Elena had never seen in a wild predator facing an animal that should have been either prey or competition. Sierra lowered her head, her nose twitching as she thoroughly investigated the kitten's scent. The little calico remained frozen, perhaps understanding that any sudden movement could trigger an instinctive attack response. For a long moment, nothing happened. Sierra simply stood there, her golden eyes studying the kitten with an intensity that seemed almost contemplative. Elena's fingers hovered over the radio again, torn between her duty to document natural behavior and her growing certainty that she needed to intervene before heat exposure killed them both. The temperature had climbed to 111 degrees, and even Sierra, adapted to desert life, was showing signs of distress. Then Sierra did something that made Elena's scientific training collide head-on with the impossible evidence of her own eyes. The pregnant bobcat lay down, not in a predatory crouch, not in preparation for an attack, but in the relaxed posture of a mother cat settling in with her kittens. She positioned herself so that her body created a barrier of shade for the tiny calico, her larger form blocking the direct assault of the afternoon sun. The kitten, responding to some instinct deeper than fear or logic, crawled closer to Sierra's belly, seeking the comfort of her presence. Elena's hands shook as she activated her high-resolution camera, zooming in to capture every detail of the scene. This wasn't just unusual behavior. This was scientifically significant, the kind of observation that could rewrite understanding of predator-maternal instinct and cross-species interaction. A pregnant bobcat, weeks away from delivering her own kittens, had not only defended a domestic kitten from a coyote pack, but was now actively protecting it from environmental threats. The questions cascaded through Elena's mind, faster than she could process them. Had Sierra lost a litter recently, leaving her maternal hormones primed but without an outlet? Was there something about the kitten's scent, perhaps similar pheromones shared by all felines, that triggered protective rather than predatory responses? Or was this something even more profound, evidence that the capacity for compassion and protection could transcend species boundaries when circumstances aligned? She needed to act. The academic fascination, the desire to observe and document without interference, had to yield to immediate practical concerns. Both cats would die if left in this heat much longer. Sierra might survive until evening, but the kitten had perhaps an hour before dehydration, and heat exhaustion proved fatal. Elena grabbed her rescue kit, checked that her tranquilizer gun was loaded with a mild sedative dose appropriate for a Bobcat Sierra's size, and headed for the door. The walk from her research station to the rock outcropping took 12 minutes, every second of which Elena spent rehearsing potential scenarios. If Sierra perceived her as a threat to the kitten, the Bobcat might attack. If the approach frightened Sierra into fleeing, the kitten would be left alone and defenseless again. Elena needed to project calm authority while remaining prepared for sudden violence, a balance that years in the field had taught her was more art than science. As she crested the small rise that would bring her within sight of the rocks, Elena slowed her pace and began making soft, non-threatening sounds. She had worked with habituated bobcats before, animals accustomed to human presence through months of careful conditioning. Sierra wasn't habituated, but she also wasn't completely naive to human scent. The research cameras, while motion-activated and unobtrusive, still carried human odor, and Sierra had never shown particular alarm at their presence. Sierra's head lifted the moment Elena came into view, her ears swiveling to track the new arrival. The bobcat's body tensed, protective instinct warring with self-preservation. Elena stopped moving, giving Sierra time to process her presence and make her own decision about whether this new human represented a threat. The tranquilizer gun remained holstered at Elena's hip, a last resort she hoped desperately to avoid using. Long seconds passed. Elena remained motionless, letting Sierra take the lead in this interaction. The bobcat's nose worked constantly, processing Elena's scent, cataloging information that would inform her response. The kitten, still pressed against Sierra's side, mewed softly, a sound of distress that seemed to make Sierra's decision for her. The bobcat looked down at the kitten, then back at Elena, and in that moment of eye contact, Elena felt a flash of understanding pass between them. Sierra knew the kitten was dying. She also knew, through whatever mysterious wisdom wild animals possessed, that she couldn't save it alone. The human standing 30 feet away represented possibility, represented resources and capabilities that Sierra's instinct recognized even if she couldn't articulate them. It was a gamble, trusting a creature that bobcats had learned over generations to avoid. But maternal instinct, whether directed at her own unborn kittens or this strange foundling she had claimed, was driving decisions that pure survival logic would never support. Elena took one slow step forward. Sierra's ears flattened slightly, a warning, but she didn't rise or prepare to flee. Another step. The bobcat's tail twitched, anxiety evident in every line of her body, but still she held her ground. Elena continued her glacial advance, each movement telegraphed and deliberate, giving Sierra every opportunity to change her mind and escape. But the pregnant bobcat remained where she was, her body curled protectively around the kitten that had somehow become her responsibility. When Elena was finally close enough to clearly see both animals without binoculars, the full extent of the kitten's distress became apparent. Its fur was matted not just with dust but with dried saliva, suggesting it had been wandering the desert for at least a day, possibly longer. Its eyes, while open and tracking movement, showed the glassy quality of severe dehydration. Without immediate hydration, the kitten would slip into shock within hours. Elena knelt slowly, reducing her profile to seem less threatening. She pulled a collapsible water bowl from her pack and filled it from her canteen, then slid it across the sand toward Sierra. The bobcat watched the bowl's approach with suspicion, but when it came to rest a few feet away, her thirst overcame her caution. She rose carefully, stepping away from the kitten just enough to reach the bowl, and began lapping at the water with desperate intensity. The moment Sierra moved, Helena saw her opportunity. The kitten was exposed, vulnerable, within reach. But even as her hand extended toward the little calico, Sierra's head snapped up from the water bowl, her eyes locking onto Elena with unmistakable warning. The message was clear. The water was accepted. The human's presence was tolerated, but any attempt to take the kitten would be met with violence. Elena withdrew her hand slowly, respecting the boundary Sierra had established. This was more complex than a simple rescue now. Sierra had claimed the kitten, had fought for it, had appointed herself its guardian. Simply taking it by force would traumatize both animals and could result in serious injury to all three of them. Elena needed a different approach, one that would allow her to help while respecting the extraordinary bond that had formed between these two unlikely companions. She settled into a sitting position, making herself as non-threatening as possible, and pulled out her radio. Her voice was quiet as she called back to the research station, leaving a message on the automated system about her situation. She would need supplies, need veterinary consultation, need help that would take hours to arrive. Until then, she would wait, sharing the shade and the heat with a pregnant bobcat and a dying kitten. 3 lives temporarily aligned by circumstance and the mysterious compassion that sometimes flowered in the desert's harsh embrace. The afternoon sun continued its merciless assault on the desert landscape as Elena maintained her vigil alongside Sierra and the kitten. 2 hours had passed since she first approached the rocks. 2 hours of careful, almost meditative patience as she worked to build trust with a wild animal whose instincts screamed at her to flee. The temperature had peaked at 113 degrees before finally beginning its slow descent toward evening. Elena's water supply was running low, rationed carefully between herself and the bowl she had placed for Sierra. The bobcat had returned to the water bowl 3 more times, each visit marked by slightly less wariness of Elena's presence. After the 3rd drink, Sierra had even allowed the kitten to crawl back against her side, though she maintained constant vigilance, her eyes never leaving Elena for more than a few seconds. The researcher understood this dance of trust. In the wild, letting your guard down meant death, and Sierra was already taking unprecedented risks by not fleeing from human proximity. Elena had managed to slide a 2nd bowl closer, this one containing water mixed with a small amount of electrolyte powder from her emergency medical kit. The kitten needed hydration desperately, but it was too weak to drink on its own. When Sierra next rose to drink, Elena saw her chance. Moving with exquisite slowness, she dipped her fingers into the electrolyte solution and extended her hand toward the kitten, letting droplets fall near its mouth. The little calico's tongue emerged automatically, licking at the moisture. Its survival instinct recognized the life-giving fluid even if its exhausted body could barely respond. Elena continued this process, drawing Sierra's attention away from the perceived threat by ensuring the bobcat's own thirst was satisfied while simultaneously working to rehydrate the kitten. It was a delicate balance requiring absolute focus and patience that most people could never muster. Sierra watched these ministrations with an intensity that seemed almost analytical. The bobcat's intelligence was evident in her eyes, in the way she processed Elena's actions and measured them against her own understanding of threat and assistance. Elena had studied enough predators to recognize the cognitive assessment happening behind those golden eyes. Sierra was learning, adapting, recalculating the risk-reward equation with each passing minute. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and crimson, Elena heard the distant sound of an engine. Her backup was arriving, the graduate student who helped manage the research station during busy observation periods. Marcus Webb was 26, brilliant with data analysis but relatively inexperienced with direct wildlife interaction. Elena grabbed her radio to warn him off before his approach could spook Sierra into fleeing. "Marcus, this is Elena," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stop the vehicle at least 200 yards out and approach on foot, slowly, and bring the veterinary kit from the cold storage, the small animal supplies, and extra water. We have a situation here that's going to require very delicate handling." The response crackled back immediately. "Copy that, Dr. Martinez. Is there danger? Should I bring the tranquilizer rifle?" Elena glanced at Sierra, who had raised her head at the sound of the radio, but hadn't bolted. Negative on the rifle. "Just the supplies I mentioned and your calmest possible approach. I'll brief you when you get here." The next 20 minutes tested Elena's patience as she tracked Marcus's progress through occasional glimpses of movement in the distance. She used the time to continue her slow rehabilitation of the kitten, managing to get nearly 2 ounces of electrolyte solution into the tiny animal through her patient, drop-by-drop method. The kitten's responses were growing stronger, its eyes more focused, though it still lacked the strength to stand or move away from Sierra's protective presence. When Marcus finally came into view, moving with commendable caution, Elena saw his eyes widen as he took in the scene. A wild, pregnant bobcat lying in casual proximity to a human researcher, with a domestic kitten nestled against her side, was not something covered in any wildlife management textbook. He stopped at Elena's subtle hand signal, remaining about 40 feet away. "Dr. Martinez," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of awe. "Is that what I think it is?" Elena nodded slightly, not taking her eyes off Sierra, a pregnant female bobcat who fought off 5 coyotes to protect a domestic kitten she found abandoned out here. "She's been allowing me to provide water and assist with the kitten's hydration, but she's not going to let me just take it. We need to figure out a way to help them both without destroying the trust we've built." Marcus set down his pack carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. "That's impossible. Bobcats don't exhibit maternal behavior toward other species, especially not when they're pregnant with their own litters. The resource competition alone should trigger aggressive or avoidance responses. Welcome to today's lesson in why we observe nature rather than just reading about it," Elena replied with a tired smile. "Everything you just said is textbook correct and completely irrelevant to what's actually happening right here. Now, did you bring the veterinary supplies? Everything you asked for, plus I grabbed the portable ultrasound unit. Thought you might want to check the bobcat's pregnancy status given the stress she's been under." Elena considered this. The ultrasound unit was designed for field use, compact and battery-operated, perfect for assessing pregnant wildlife without requiring capture or sedation. But using it would require getting close enough to Sierra to place the probe against her abdomen, a level of contact that seemed impossible given the current situation. Unless Sierra continued her trajectory of increasing trust, which was far from guaranteed. As if reading Elena's thoughts, Sierra rose from her resting position and stretched, her pregnant belly clearly visible as her spine curved. The movement gave Elena a better view of the bobcat's condition than she had managed all afternoon. Sierra's teats were already beginning to show the engorgement that came in the final weeks of pregnancy, and her gait as she moved to the water bowl showed the subtle awkwardness of carrying extra weight. Elena estimated she was perhaps 3 weeks from giving birth, maybe less. The kitten, left exposed by Sierra's movement, struggled to follow, managing to get its front legs under its body but unable to coordinate its hind legs. The effort exhausted it, and it collapsed back onto the sand, mewing piteously. Sierra's head snapped around at the sound, and she abandoned the water bowl to return to the kitten's side, nosing it with surprising gentleness. That's when Elena realized what she was witnessing extended beyond simple protection or even misplaced maternal instinct. Sierra was bonding with this kitten. The bobcat's behavior showed all the signs of genuine attachment, the kind that developed between mothers and their offspring. Something in this encounter, whether hormonal or psychological or some combination the scientific literature had yet to document, had triggered a maternal response so strong it overrode every other instinct. "Marcus," Elena said quietly, "I need you to document everything I'm about to do, video and stills both. This is going to sound crazy, but I think we can get close enough to examine both animals if we move together as a unit. Sierra seems to understand that we're trying to help. She's made it this far without fleeing. I think she'll let us continue." Dr. Martinez, with respect, that's an enormous assumption to make about a wild predator. If she feels cornered or threatened, she could attack. Pregnant animals are notoriously unpredictable when they feel their young are at risk. "I'm aware of the risks," Elena said firmly, "but that kitten is going to die without medical intervention, and Sierra's stress levels are dangerously elevated. If we don't act now, we'll lose our window. Sometimes you have to trust what you're observing rather than what you expect to observe." She turned her attention back to Sierra, making eye contact with the bobcat in a way that would typically be interpreted as challenging or aggressive. But in this moment, with the strange understanding that had developed between them, it felt more like communication. Sierra held her gaze, neither advancing nor retreating, and Elena saw something in those golden eyes that made her decision feel less like recklessness and more like the next logical step in an extraordinary collaboration. "Okay," she said, both to Marcus and to herself. "Let's see just how far this trust extends." Elena's approach was a masterclass in patience, each movement calculated to communicate non-threatening intent. She had Marcus remain stationary, his camera documenting every second of what was unfolding. The shadows were lengthening now, the brutal afternoon heat finally beginning to dissipate as evening approached. This was the time when desert predators typically became more active, when hunting instincts sharpened and territorial behaviors intensified. Working with Sierra during this transitional period added another layer of risk to an already precarious situation. The veterinary kit sat between Elena and Marcus, its contents carefully organized for quick access. Inside were subcutaneous fluid packets for emergency rehydration, antibiotics, wound care supplies, and most importantly, a small syringe of mild sedative calibrated for felines under 10 pounds. Elena hoped desperately that she wouldn't need the sedative, that the kitten's condition would allow for conscious treatment, but she had learned long ago that hope was never a substitute for preparation. Sierra watched Elena's incremental advance with unwavering attention, her body language telegraphing caution but not outright hostility. The bobcat had positioned herself so that the kitten remained partially beneath her, protected by her larger body while still allowing Elena visual access. It was a compromise position, Elena realized, a wild animal's attempt to balance conflicting needs, the need to protect, and the recognition that protection might require accepting help from an unlikely source. When Elena was finally within arm's reach, she stopped and simply sat, making no move toward either animal. This was the critical moment, the point where Sierra would either accept this unprecedented level of intrusion or would bolt, taking the kitten beyond any possibility of help. Long seconds stretched into a full minute. Elena's legs were cramping from the uncomfortable position, sweat trickling down her back despite the cooling temperature, but she remained absolutely still. Sierra made the decision. The bobcat lay down fully, extending her body along the sand in a posture that exposed her pregnant belly, the ultimate gesture of trust in the animal kingdom. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, though she blinked them away quickly. In her entire career, spanning thousands of hours of wildlife observation, she had never witnessed anything approaching this moment of interspecies understanding. Moving with exquisite care, Elena opened the veterinary kit and removed the most essential items: the fluid packet, a small gauge needle, and sterile gloves. She narrated her actions in a soft, continuous murmur, letting her voice create a backdrop of predictable sound that might help keep Sierra calm. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I'm going to attempt subcutaneous hydration on the kitten. Keep your camera steady, but be ready to pull back if Sierra shows any signs of aggression." The kitten was in worse condition than Elena had initially assessed. Up close, she could see that its paw pads were cracked and bleeding from walking on scorching sand. Its gums were pale and tacky from dehydration, and its body temperature was dangerously elevated. The little calico couldn't have weighed more than 2 pounds, suggesting it was somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks old, barely weaned and completely dependent on care it had clearly been denied. Elena slipped on the sterile gloves and prepared the fluid line, her movements automatic from years of emergency wildlife care. The subcutaneous injection would deliver hydration directly into the space between the kitten's skin and muscle, allowing rapid absorption while avoiding the complications of intravenous access. Her hands were steady as she gently grasped the scruff of the kitten's neck, lifting a small fold of skin to create the pocket where the fluid would collect. Sierra's attention intensified, her eyes tracking Elena's every movement with laser focus. A low sound rumbled in the bobcat's throat, not quite a growl, but definitely a warning. Elena froze, the needle poised but not yet inserted, giving Sierra time to assess and accept what was happening. The rumbling continued for several seconds, then gradually faded. Sierra's head lowered slightly, not in submission but in what seemed like reluctant permission. The needle slid beneath the kitten's skin with practiced precision, and Elena began the slow process of administering the fluid. The kitten mewed weakly but didn't struggle, either too exhausted to resist or somehow understanding that this discomfort was different from threat. As the fluid pocket formed beneath its skin, creating a visible bulge along its side, Elena monitored both the kitten's response and Sierra's body language with equal attention. The entire process took 4 minutes, though it felt like an hour. When Elena finally withdrew the needle and released the kitten, Sierra immediately began grooming the small animal, her rough tongue working over its matted fur with surprising gentleness. The maternal behavior was so pronounced, so natural, that Elena found herself questioning whether there might be some biological mechanism at play that science had simply never documented because the circumstances required to trigger it were too rare to observe. "Marcus," Elena said, not taking her eyes off the animals, "I want you to make note of every detail of Sierra's maternal behaviors, the grooming pattern, the frequency of physical contact, the protective positioning. This could be the first documented case of spontaneous cross-species maternal adoption in wild bobcats under natural conditions." Marcus's camera clicked steadily as he captured images from every angle his position allowed. His scientific training was evident in the systematic way he documented the scene, but his voice carried genuine wonder when he spoke. "Dr. Martinez, I've got clear footage of her licking the kitten's face and ears. The behavior is identical to what female bobcats show with their own young. How is this possible?" Elena shook her head slowly, still processing what she was witnessing. Hormonal surges in late pregnancy can create powerful maternal drives. Add extreme circumstances, isolation, perhaps the loss of a previous litter we don't know about, and the scent similarities between feline species. It's possible that Sierra's brain is simply categorizing this kitten as hers, overriding the normal species recognition that would prevent this kind of bonding. With the immediate crisis of the kitten's dehydration addressed, Elena turned her attention to Sierra herself. The pregnant bobcat's condition was concerning. The stress of the confrontation with the coyotes, combined with hours in extreme heat while defending the kitten, had taken a visible toll. Sierra's breathing was slightly labored, and Elena could see the subtle tremors of exhaustion running through her muscles. The ultrasound unit Marcus had brought sat in his backpack, tantalizing in its potential to provide critical information about Sierra's pregnancy. But using it would require a level of contact that might shatter the fragile trust they had built. Elena weighed the risks against the benefits, her mind running through scenarios and outcomes with the speed of long practice. Sierra, as if sensing Elena's consideration, rolled slightly onto her side, exposing more of her swollen abdomen. The movement seemed almost deliberate, as if the bobcat understood that the strange humans might be able to help with more than just the kitten. Elena caught her breath at the implications. Was Sierra actually requesting assistance? Could a wild animal's intelligence and desperation combine to create something approaching conscious cooperation with humans? There was only one way to find out. Helena reached slowly for the ultrasound unit, pulling it from Marcus's pack with movements telegraphed clearly so Sierra could track her intentions. The device was compact, designed for field veterinary work, with a small screen and a portable probe that could be used without conductive gel in emergency situations, though the image quality would be reduced. "I'm going to try something that probably violates every protocol we have," Elena said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Marcus, document everything. If this works, it could change how we understand wildlife intelligence and communication. If it doesn't work and Sierra attacks, I need you to use the air horn to scare her off, then get to safety." She activated the ultrasound unit, letting Sierra see and hear the device power up, letting the bobcat process this new element in their interaction. Then, moving with the same glacial patience she had maintained throughout the afternoon, Elena extended the probe toward Sierra's exposed abdomen. The bobcat's eyes tracked the device, her body tensing, but she didn't pull away. Elena's hand trembled slightly as the probe made contact with fur and skin. The ultrasound screen flickered to life, showing the grainy black and white image of Sierra's internal landscape. Elena adjusted the probe angle, seeking the telltale shapes that would reveal the condition of the unborn kittens. What she saw made her catch her breath in surprise and sudden understanding. The ultrasound revealed a truth that explained everything and nothing all at once. Sierra was carrying only a single kitten, an unusual situation for bobcats, who typically birthed litters of 2 to 4. The solitary fetus appeared healthy, its heartbeat strong and steady on the monitor, but Elena's trained eye immediately recognized the complications this presented. Single kitten pregnancies in felines often resulted from spontaneous abortion of other embryos early in development, suggesting Sierra's body had experienced significant stress during the initial weeks of pregnancy. More telling were the signs of an earlier pregnancy that had clearly ended in loss. Elena could see the subtle scarring in Sierra's uterine tissue, the markers of a previous gestation that had terminated prematurely. The timeline suggested Sierra had lost that litter perhaps 2 months before conceiving again, making this current pregnancy even more precious to the bobcat's biological imperatives. The maternal hormones flooding Sierra's system had nowhere to direct themselves except toward the single kitten developing inside her and, unexpectedly, the orphaned domestic kitten she had found. "Marcus," Elena said softly, not wanting to disturb Sierra's remarkable tolerance of the ultrasound examination. She lost a previous litter recently, and this pregnancy is singleton, which means her maternal drive is probably overwhelming. She's essentially experiencing the hormonal equivalent of having multiple kittens to care for, but with only one on the way. That little calico is filling a biological need that Sierra's own pregnancy can't completely satisfy. Marcus adjusted his camera angle to capture the ultrasound screen while keeping Sierra in frame. So she's not confused about species. She knows the calico isn't hers, but is adopting it anyway. Elena moved the probe slightly, getting a clearer image of the developing kitten inside Sierra. I think it's more complex than simple confusion. Sierra's intelligent enough to recognize species differences, but her hormonal state is creating what we might call emotional logic that supersedes rational categorization. The calico needs a mother. Sierra needs to mother. In her current state, those needs align perfectly. The bobcat shifted slightly, and Elena immediately withdrew the probe, respecting the boundary of Sierra's comfort. She had gotten enough information to understand the biological framework underlying this extraordinary behavior, and pushing for more would risk destroying the trust they had built. Sierra's golden eyes met Elena's, and for the second time that day, the researcher felt that strange sense of communication passing between species. "Thank you," Elena whispered to the bobcat, knowing the words meant nothing to Sierra but needing to express her gratitude anyway. "You're incredible, you know that?" Sierra responded by turning her attention back to the calico kitten, which was showing signs of improvement from the subcutaneous fluids. The little cat's eyes were brighter, more alert, and it managed to lift its head for several seconds before exhaustion claimed it again. Sierra resumed her grooming, her rough tongue working methodically across the kitten's matted fur, slowly restoring some semblance of cleanliness and order. As the desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Elena and Marcus worked to establish a more permanent support system for their unusual charges. They couldn't simply take the kitten, not with Sierra so bonded to it, but leaving them both in the desert overnight presented its own dangers. The temperature would drop dramatically after dark, potentially into the 40s, and while Sierra's thick coat would protect her, the kitten was dangerously thin and might not survive the cold. Elena made a decision that would have horrified her academic advisors. "We're camping here tonight, both of us. We'll set up a monitoring perimeter and take shifts watching them. If Sierra decides to move locations, we follow at a distance. If the kitten's condition deteriorates, we intervene, but we don't separate them unless absolutely necessary." Marcus nodded, already mentally cataloging the supplies they would need from the research station. "I'll go back and get camping gear, more water, food for us, and potentially for them. What about the kitten's nutrition? It needs more than water. At its age, it should still be on milk, or at least soft food." Elena considered this, her eyes never leaving Sierra and her adopted charge. "Bring kitten formula and soft food, but also some raw meat. Small pieces. If Sierra sees us feeding the kitten, she might understand we're trying to help it survive. And bring the thermal imaging camera. I want to monitor both their body temperatures through the night." As Marcus headed back to the research station, moving carefully to avoid startling Sierra, Elena settled in for what promised to be an extraordinary vigil. She had spent countless nights in the field, observing wildlife from blinds and remote cameras, but this was different. This was active participation in a phenomenon that might occur only once in a lifetime, a front-row seat to behavior that would challenge scientific understanding of maternal instinct and interspecies bonding. The kitten managed to crawl a few inches, its improved hydration giving it marginally more strength. Sierra immediately adjusted her position to accommodate the movement, keeping the small cat within the protective curve of her body. The bobcat's ears rotated constantly, monitoring the darkening desert for threats. But she seemed to have accepted Elena's presence as neutral, perhaps even helpful. Elena used the quiet time to update her field notes, documenting everything she had observed with the meticulous detail that scientific rigor demanded. The encounter with the coyotes, Sierra's defensive behavior, the establishment of trust with Elena, the ultrasound findings, every detail went into her tablet with timestamps and observational notes. This wasn't just a remarkable wildlife encounter anymore. This was potentially groundbreaking research that could inform understanding of animal cognition, maternal behavior, and the flexibility of instinctive responses. As darkness fell completely, the desert transformed. The oppressive heat dissipated, replaced by the crisp cold that defined desert nights. Stars emerged in stunning profusion, undimmed by artificial light, painting the sky with ancient patterns. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, the sound carrying clearly through the still air. Sierra's ears perked up at the sound, and she drew the calico kitten even closer to her body. Marcus returned 90 minutes later, moving with impressive stealth for someone carrying a full pack of camping supplies. He had brought everything Elena requested, plus some additions of his own: a portable battery pack for their equipment, thermal blankets, and a small propane heater that could provide warmth without open flames. They set up a minimal camp 20 feet from Sierra's position, far enough to avoid crowding her but close enough to intervene if necessary. The thermal imaging camera revealed what Elena's eyes couldn't see in the darkness. Sierra's body temperature was elevated, normal for late pregnancy, but still concerning given the stress she had endured. The kitten's temperature was lower than ideal, but within acceptable ranges thanks to Sierra's warmth and the subcutaneous fluids. Elena and Marcus took turns monitoring the thermal images throughout the early evening, documenting the patterns of movement and rest. Around 10 o'clock, Sierra rose and began grooming herself, a sign that she was feeling secure enough to attend to her own needs. The kitten mewed at the loss of contact, and Sierra responded by carefully picking it up by the scruff, the way mother cats transport their young. Elena and Marcus watched in amazement as Sierra carried the kitten to a different position among the rocks, a spot that offered better shelter from the night breeze. "She's den-making," Elena whispered, recognizing the behavior. "She's not just protecting the kitten temporarily, she's treating it as her own, preparing for the long term." Marcus checked his camera settings, ensuring he was capturing this moment. This completely rewrites what we understand about Bobcat maternal flexibility. If she's genuinely incorporated this kitten into her family unit, the implications for wildlife rehabilitation and conservation strategies could be enormous. Elena nodded, but her attention remained fixed on Sierra and the kitten. The academic implications were significant, certainly, but what moved her most was the simple compassion being displayed. A wild animal, driven by instinct and circumstance, had chosen to protect a creature that offered her no biological advantage. In a world that often seemed ruled by survival of the fittest and ruthless competition, Sierra was demonstrating that nature had room for something approaching what humans might call kindness. The night brought challenges Elena hadn't fully anticipated. Around midnight, the temperature dropped to 43 degrees, and the kitten began showing signs of distress despite Sierra's best efforts to keep it warm. The little calico was shivering violently, its weakened system unable to maintain proper body temperature even with the bobcat's body heat. Elena watched through the thermal camera as the kitten's temperature reading dropped into the danger zone, knowing she had to act quickly or risk losing the fragile life they had worked so hard to preserve. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I need to get the heating pad closer to them. That kitten's core temperature is dropping too fast. If it goes into hypothermic shock, Sierra won't be able to save it with body heat alone." Marcus looked up from his monitoring station, concern evident even in the dim light of their equipment. "How are you going to get close enough without spooking her? She's already on edge from the temperature drop." Elena was already moving, pulling a small electric heating pad from their medical supplies and wrapping it in a soft towel. She had a plan, risky but potentially effective. She would approach slowly, place the heating pad near Sierra's chosen den site, and hope the bobcat recognized it as helpful rather than threatening. The alternative was watching the kitten die from exposure, something Elena's conscience couldn't bear after they had come this far. The approach through darkness was even more nerve-wracking than the afternoon's careful advance. Elena used a dim, red-filtered flashlight, knowing that red wavelengths were less disruptive to nocturnal animals' night vision. Sierra's eyes gleamed in the reflected light, 2 golden coins floating in the darkness, tracking Elena's every movement. The bobcat's body had tensed the moment Elena stood up, protective instinct overriding any trust they had built during daylight hours. "Sierra," Elena said softly, keeping her voice low and soothing. "The kitten's cold. You know it's cold. I'm trying to help. Just like before. Just helping." She had no illusion that Sierra understood her words, but tone and body language transcended species barriers. Elena's posture was submissive, non-threatening, her movements slow and predictable. She held the heating pad out where Sierra could see it, letting the bobcat process this new element before attempting to place it. Sierra's response surprised them both. Instead of hissing or retreating, the bobcat stood and took 2 steps toward Elena, the kitten still clutched gently in her mouth. For a heart-stopping moment, Elena thought Sierra might be bringing the kitten to her, actively seeking help. But the bobcat stopped halfway between her den site and Elena's position, setting the kitten down, but maintaining her stance over it. It was an invitation and a boundary simultaneously. Sierra was allowing Elena to approach, but on the bobcat's terms, in a neutral space where she could monitor the human's actions closely. Elena felt a surge of admiration for the intelligence being displayed. Sierra wasn't just protecting blindly. She was problem-solving, assessing situations and making decisions that balanced her protective instincts with practical needs. Elena knelt slowly, placing the heating pad on the ground between them. She activated it to the lowest setting, letting it begin warming before sliding it closer to where Sierra held the kitten. The bobcat sniffed at the pad suspiciously, one paw reaching out to touch it experimentally. When she felt the warmth radiating from the fabric, something shifted in her demeanor. She looked at Elena, then at the heating pad, then back at Elena, and the researcher could almost see understanding dawn in those intelligent eyes. Sierra picked up the kitten again and moved it directly onto the heating pad, positioning the small animal so it could absorb the artificial warmth while she lay alongside, adding her own body heat to the equation. The kitten's shivering began to subside almost immediately, its tiny body relaxing as the warmth penetrated its core. Sierra resumed her grooming, her rough tongue working to stimulate circulation in the kitten's extremities. Elena retreated slowly, giving Sierra space while maintaining visual contact. When she returned to the monitoring station, Marcus had already documented the entire exchange with both video and thermal imaging. The thermal camera showed the kitten's temperature beginning to stabilize, the dangerous downward trend reversed by the combination of artificial and natural warming. "That was incredible," Marcus breathed, his professional objectivity momentarily overcome by genuine awe. "She understood what you were trying to do, not just tolerated it, but actively participated. Dr. Martinez, we're documenting cognitive problem-solving in a wild predator that rivals anything seen in captive studies." Elena nodded, though her focus remained on Sierra and the kitten. "What we're seeing goes beyond simple intelligence. Sierra's experiencing something like what humans might call maternal love. It's overriding her natural wariness, her survival instincts, even her species recognition. The question is whether this bond will survive once her biological kitten is born. Will she abandon the calico? Try to care for both? Reject one or the other? The rest of the night passed in 2-hour watch shifts, with Elena and Marcus alternating between sleep and observation. Around 3 in the morning, during Marcus's shift, he woke Elena with urgent but quiet insistence. "Dr. Martinez, you need to see this." Elena was alert immediately, years of fieldwork having trained her to wake fully at the first sign of something requiring attention. She joined Marcus at the monitoring station, following his pointing finger toward Sierra's position. The bobcat had moved again, this time to a more sheltered spot among the rocks that created an almost cave-like enclosure. But that wasn't what had caught Marcus's attention. Sierra was trying to feed the kitten. She had deposited a small, partially eaten mouse near the calico's mouth, nudging it with her nose in the unmistakable gesture of a mother encouraging her young to eat solid food. The kitten, still weak but significantly improved from its earlier crisis state, sniffed at the offering but lacked the strength or perhaps the instinct to actually consume the raw meat. Elena's mind raced through the implications. Sierra was attempting to teach the kitten to hunt, or at least to eat like a bobcat kitten would eat. This wasn't just protection anymore. This was active parenting, the kind of behavioral instruction that mother cats provided to prepare their young for independence. The level of commitment being displayed was staggering. "We need to intervene," Elena said, making a decision. "That kitten needs proper nutrition, something it can actually digest and consume. If we don't provide appropriate food, it's going to starve even while Sierra tries her best to feed it." She gathered the kitten formula and soft food Marcus had brought from the research station, warming the formula slightly, using their portable heater. The approach this time was easier, Sierra now recognizing Elena as a source of assistance rather than threat. The bobcat watched with intense interest as Elena mixed the formula with a small amount of soft kitten food, creating a nutritious gruel that would be easier for the weakened kitten to consume. Using a small syringe without the needle, Elena drew up some of the mixture and approached the kitten. Sierra's ears flattened slightly, but she didn't interfere as Elena carefully placed a drop of formula on the kitten's lips. The little calico's tongue emerged automatically, licking at the nutrition, and its response was immediate and enthusiastic. Within minutes, Elena had managed to get nearly 2 ounces of formula into the kitten, more nutrition than it had probably consumed in the past 48 hours. Sierra watched this feeding process with what could only be described as fascination. When Elena finished and withdrew, the bobcat immediately began grooming the kitten's face, cleaning away the traces of formula with her rough tongue. But then she did something that made Elena's heart skip a beat. Sierra approached the bowl where Elena had mixed the formula, sniffed it thoroughly, then looked back at Elena with unmistakable expectation. "She wants to learn," Elena whispered to Marcus. "She's watching how I feed the kitten so she can do it herself." "Marcus, we're watching a wild bobcat actively trying to learn cross-species parenting techniques from a human." Dawn broke over the desert with spectacular beauty, painting the landscape in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost unreal in their intensity. Elena had managed perhaps 3 hours of sleep total, her body exhausted, but her mind too engaged with the extraordinary events unfolding to truly rest. She emerged from her sleeping bag to find Sierra already awake, grooming the calico kitten with methodical attention, while the little cat made small sounds of contentment that seemed impossible given its condition just 12 hours earlier. The transformation in the kitten was remarkable. Proper hydration, nutrition, and warmth had worked small miracles on its tiny body. While still weak and underweight, the calico was now able to stand for extended periods, its legs no longer trembling with the effort. Its eyes were bright and alert, tracking the movements of birds overhead with the instinctive interest of a predator, however small and helpless it might currently be. Marcus was already at the monitoring station, reviewing the overnight footage and making detailed notes. The thermal imaging had captured something extraordinary around 4 in the morning. Sierra had apparently attempted to nurse the kitten, positioning it near her teats in the way mother cats do with their young. The kitten had responded instinctively, seeking milk that wasn't yet there. Sierra's mammary glands were developing but wouldn't produce milk until after she gave birth to her biological kitten. The attempt at nursing was perhaps the most powerful evidence yet of how completely Sierra had integrated the calico into her concept of family. Nursing was the most intimate and resource-intensive form of maternal care, requiring significant caloric investment from the mother. That Sierra would even attempt it with a kitten that wasn't biologically hers spoke to the depth of her maternal commitment. Elena prepared another feeding for the calico, warming formula, while Sierra watched with that same intense interest she had shown during the night. This time, when Elena approached with the syringe of formula, Sierra rose and stepped aside, creating space for the human to work. It was another sign of trust, another indication that Sierra understood they were cooperating in the care of this vulnerable animal. As Elena fed the kitten, she found herself talking to Sierra in a low, conversational tone. "You're going to be a wonderful mother to your own baby. The kitten inside you is lucky to have someone as fierce and devoted as you. And this little one," she nodded toward the calico, "this little one owes you its life." Sierra's ears rotated toward Elena's voice, processing the sounds even if the words themselves held no meaning. When the feeding was complete, the bobcat immediately took over, grooming the kitten's face and body with renewed vigor. Elena stepped back and rejoined Marcus at the monitoring station, leaving Sierra to her maternal rituals. "We need to make a decision soon," Marcus said quietly. "We can't camp out here indefinitely, and the kitten needs veterinary care beyond what we can provide in the field. But separating it from Sierra now could traumatize both animals and potentially impact Sierra's ability to care for her biological kitten when it's born." Elena had been wrestling with this exact problem through her sleepless hours. The kitten needed vaccinations, deworming, a thorough medical examination, and continued nutritional support. But Sierra's bond with the calico had become so integral to her psychological state that removing it could trigger stress responses that might endanger her pregnancy. The solution, when it came to her, seemed almost absurdly simple in its complexity. "We bring them both to the rehabilitation facility," Elena said, the plan crystallizing as she spoke. "We have the large feline enclosure that's been empty since we released those mountain lion cubs last month. It's designed to mimic natural den environments while allowing for medical monitoring and care. Sierra can have her privacy, her security, but we can provide support for both her and the kitten." Marcus considered this, his expression thoughtful. "That's going to require approval from the Parks and Wildlife Department. They don't typically authorize keeping wild bobcats in rehabilitation facilities, especially pregnant ones. The protocol is to allow natural processes to occur without human interference." Elena's jaw set with determination. "Then we make the case that this isn't typical. Sierra has bonded with a domestic animal that requires human care to survive. Separating them could cause Sierra significant stress during a critical period of her pregnancy. We're not interfering with natural processes. We're supporting them while managing the complications created by human activity, because I guarantee you that kitten didn't wander into the desert on its own. Someone dumped it, or it escaped from a nearby property." The morning passed in a flurry of radio communications and careful observation. Elena contacted her supervisor at the Parks and Wildlife Department, laying out the situation with clinical precision while emphasizing the unique scientific opportunity this presented. The conversation was tense, with her supervisor initially resistant to the idea of bringing a wild pregnant bobcat into captivity, even temporarily. But Elena's reputation and the extraordinary documentation Marcus had compiled eventually won the argument. By noon, they had authorization to transport both animals to the rehabilitation facility, with specific conditions attached. Sierra would be housed in the large outdoor enclosure with minimal human contact. The kitten would remain with her as long as Sierra tolerated its presence. Medical interventions would be kept to absolute necessities. And most importantly, plans for Sierra's eventual release back to the wild would begin immediately, with the understanding that the calico could not accompany her. The challenge now was actually executing the transport without destroying the trust they had built. Elena and Marcus spent 2 hours preparing, setting up a large transport crate that would accommodate both Sierra and the kitten comfortably. They lined it with familiar materials from Sierra's chosen den site, hoping the scent would provide continuity and comfort during what would be a stressful experience. The approach with the crate was delicate work. Elena positioned it near Sierra's location, leaving the door open so the Bobcat could investigate at her own pace. She placed food inside, the kitten formula that Sierra had shown interest in, along with fresh water. Then she and Marcus retreated to let Sierra make her own decision about whether to enter. 2 hours passed with agonizing slowness. Sierra circled the crate multiple times, sniffing thoroughly, clearly suspicious of this new element in her environment. The kitten, recovering more of its mobility with each passing hour, attempted to toddle toward the crate on unsteady legs, attracted by the scent of food. Sierra immediately retrieved it, carrying the calico back to the den site by its scruff, but the kitten was persistent and the food was appealing. On its third attempt to reach the crate, Sierra finally followed, rather than preventing the movement. The Bobcat watched as the kitten entered the crate, making small sounds of hunger and interest. After a long moment of hesitation, Sierra followed her adopted charge inside. Elena's hand hovered over the remote release for the crate door, her heart pounding. This was the moment that could either work perfectly or shatter everything they had built. She waited until Sierra was fully inside, focused on the kitten rather than the crate walls. Then she triggered the release. The door swung shut with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the desert silence. Sierra's reaction was immediate and explosive. She threw herself against the crate walls, a full-throated yowl of rage and fear erupting from her throat. The kitten mewed in distress, frightened by Sierra's panic. For several terrible seconds, Elena thought Sierra might injure herself or the kitten in her desperate attempt to escape. But then something remarkable happened. The kitten, probably seeking the comfort it had learned to associate with Sierra's presence, crawled toward the Bobcat and pressed itself against her side. Sierra's frantic movements slowed, then stopped. She looked down at the small calico nestled against her, and the maternal instinct that had driven so many of her recent decisions reasserted itself. Her breathing was still rapid, her pupils dilated with stress, but she curled her body around the kitten protectively, rather than continuing her escape attempts. The transport to the rehabilitation facility took 90 minutes, every second of which Elena spent monitoring Sierra and the kitten through the ventilation slots in the crate. She had covered the crate with a breathable tarp to reduce visual stimulation, hoping that limiting Sierra's ability to see the changing landscape would reduce her stress. The Bobcat remained curled around the calico, her body tense but not panicked, her attention focused entirely on the small creature she had claimed as her own. Marcus drove with extraordinary care, avoiding potholes and sudden movements that might jostle the crate unnecessarily. In the back of the truck, Elena maintained a steady stream of soft conversation, her voice providing a familiar constant in what must have been a terrifying experience for Sierra. The kitten slept through most of the journey, exhausted from its ordeal and lulled by the truck's motion, its tiny body rising and falling with each breath against Sierra's fur. The Arizona Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was located on 40 acres of carefully managed habitat 30 miles south of Tucson. The facility specialized in treating injured desert wildlife with the goal of eventual release, housing everything from injured hawks to displaced coyotes. The large feline enclosure Elena had mentioned was actually a half-acre space designed to mimic natural bobcat territory, complete with multiple den sites, elevated perches, and a small artificial stream that provided fresh running water. Dr. Rebecca Chung, the facility's head veterinarian, was waiting at the entrance when they arrived. At 53, Rebecca had spent her entire career working with wild felines, and her expertise would be crucial in managing Sierra's unique situation. She had reviewed all of Elena's documentation during the morning, but seeing the pregnant bobcat curled protectively around a domestic kitten still made her pause in professional amazement. "This is extraordinary," Rebecca said quietly as she examined the crate's occupants through the ventilation slots. "The maternal bonding appears complete. Elena, you understand that when her biological kitten is born, there's a very real possibility she'll reject the calico. The presence of her actual offspring might override whatever hormonal confusion is driving her current behavior." Elena nodded, having considered this possibility extensively during the sleepless night. "I understand. But right now, separating them could cause Sierra enough stress to endanger her pregnancy. We need to support this bond until her biological kitten arrives, then reassess based on her behavior." They moved the crate into the large enclosure using a specialized transfer system designed to minimize human contact and stress for the animals. Once the crate was positioned near the largest den site, a complex arrangement of rock formations that created multiple interconnected spaces, they opened the door remotely and retreated to the observation building 50 feet away. Sierra emerged cautiously, the kitten still clutched in her mouth. Her eyes swept the enclosure, taking in every detail of this new territory with the thorough assessment of a predator evaluating both resources and threats. The space was considerably larger than her desert territory had been, offering more options, but also more unknowns. For several minutes, she simply stood near the crate, processing her new reality. Then, decision made, Sierra carried the kitten into the den system, disappearing from view. Elena and Rebecca watched through the remote cameras installed throughout the enclosure, tracking Sierra's exploration as she investigated each chamber and passage. The bobcat was thorough in her inspection, checking every corner and crevice before finally selecting a deep chamber that offered both security and a clear view of multiple escape routes. "She's choosing a birthing den," Rebecca observed, noting how Sierra was already arranging materials in the chamber, using her paws to create a comfortable nest. "Based on your ultrasound findings, I'd estimate she has perhaps 2 weeks before she gives birth, maybe less. The stress of the past 48 hours could accelerate labor." Elena made notes on her tablet, documenting every behavior for the research paper that would eventually chronicle this unprecedented case. "What's our protocol for the kitten's medical care? We need to examine it properly, provide vaccinations, check for parasites, but I don't want to trigger a protective response from Sierra that could endanger staff." Rebecca had already developed a plan for this contingency. "We'll wait until Sierra leaves the kitten to hunt or explore. The cameras show us everything, so we'll know when we have an opportunity. The kitten still needs significant care, but it's stable enough that we can be patient and strategic about when we intervene." The first 3 days at the facility established a routine that seemed to work for everyone involved. Sierra ventured out of the den periodically to eat the food left for her, always returning quickly to check on the kitten. Elena or Rebecca would then enter the enclosure during these brief absences, performing quick medical checks on the calico and replenishing its formula supply. Sierra seemed to understand these intrusions were connected to the kitten's care, tolerating them with wary acceptance rather than aggression. The kitten, now officially named Callie by the staff despite Elena's protests about anthropomorphizing research subjects, was thriving under Sierra's devoted care. Its weight had increased by nearly 30%. Its coordination was improving daily, and the veterinary examination revealed no significant health issues beyond the dehydration and malnutrition they had already treated. Callie was estimated to be about 8 weeks old, young enough that imprinting on Sierra as a mother figure would be complete and lasting. On the 4th day, something shifted in Sierra's behavior. She became restless, moving frequently between different areas of the den system, rearranging her nest repeatedly. Her appetite decreased and she showed signs of discomfort when lying down. Rebecca recognized the signs immediately and alerted Elena. "She's entering early labor," Rebecca said, reviewing the remote camera footage. "The stress from the past week has triggered her body to begin the birthing process. We should see her biological kitten within the next 24 to 48 hours." Elena felt her heart rate increase with anxious anticipation. This was the moment that would determine whether Sierra's bond with Callie would survive or shatter. Would the arrival of her own kitten trigger rejection of the adopted calico? Would Sierra have the resources, both physical and emotional, to care for two kittens simultaneously? Or would her instincts prioritize her biological offspring, abandoning Callie to a fate the little cat would no longer survive on its own? The staff established a continuous monitoring rotation, with someone watching the camera feeds at all times. Sierra moved Callie into her chosen birthing chamber, grooming the domestic kitten with unusual intensity, as if preparing it for what was coming. Callie, now strong enough to play and explore on its own, seemed content to remain close to Sierra, purring loudly whenever the bobcat's rough tongue worked across its fur. Labor began in earnest around 3 in the morning on the 5th day. Sierra's contractions were visible on the thermal imaging cameras, rhythmic waves moving through her body as her muscles worked to deliver the kitten she had carried for the past 2 months. Elena and Rebecca watched from the observation room, both understanding that intervention was not an option unless Sierra showed clear signs of life-threatening distress. The birth took 4 hours, which was within normal ranges for a bobcat's first labor. When the kitten finally emerged, Sierra immediately began cleaning it with the intense focus that mammalian mothers displayed across species. The tiny bobcat kitten, barely larger than Callie had been when first found, mewed its first sounds of life while Sierra stimulated its breathing and circulation with her tongue. But what captured everyone's attention was what happened next. As Sierra cleaned her biological kitten, Callie approached cautiously, drawn by curiosity, or perhaps some instinct of its own. For a heart-stopping moment, Sierra's head swung toward the domestic kitten, her body tensing. This was the critical juncture, the point where instinct would dictate whether Callie was accepted or rejected from the family unit Sierra had created. Sierra looked at Callie, then at her newborn biological kitten, then back at Callie. The decision seemed to take forever, though it was probably only seconds. Then Sierra reached out with one paw and gently pulled Callie closer, positioning the domestic kitten on the other side of her body from the newborn bobcat. She resumed grooming, alternating between her 2 charges, treating both with equal attention and care. The observation room erupted in quiet celebration as the staff witnessed Sierra's acceptance of both kittens. Rebecca wiped tears from her eyes, her professional composure momentarily overwhelmed by the profound display of maternal flexibility they had just witnessed. Elena simply stared at the monitor, trying to process the implications of what she was seeing. A wild bobcat, having just given birth to her biological offspring, had chosen to maintain her bond with an adopted kitten from a different species. It was behavior that challenged fundamental assumptions about maternal instinct and evolutionary biology. Over the following weeks, Sierra proved to be an exceptional mother to both kittens. She groomed them equally, kept them warm with her body heat, and when her milk came in, she allowed both to nurse alongside each other. The biological bobcat kitten, which the staff privately named Scout, was slightly larger and more aggressive in seeking nursing position, but Sierra actively managed the dynamics to ensure Callie received adequate nutrition as well. The differences between the 2 kittens became more pronounced as they grew. Scout developed with the rapid progression typical of bobcat young, eyes opening at 10 days, mobility increasing dramatically by 3 weeks. Callie's development followed the timeline of domestic cats, slower but still healthy under Sierra's devoted care. By the time both kittens were a month old, Scout was attempting to pounce on insects and small objects, displaying the hunting instincts hardwired into bobcat genetics. Callie played as well, but with the less focused intensity of a domestic kitten. Elena documented every stage of development, her research expanding from a simple observational study into what would become landmark work on maternal behavior and neuroplasticity in wild felines. She published preliminary findings that generated significant interest in the scientific community, with researchers from around the world requesting access to her data and video documentation. The story of Sierra and her two kittens captured public imagination as well, with media coverage bringing unprecedented attention to the rehabilitation center and its work. But as the kittens approached 8 weeks of age, Elena and Rebecca faced the difficult reality they had been avoiding. Scout was developing into a healthy young bobcat who would eventually need to return to the wild. Callie, despite Sierra's best efforts, was a domestic cat who could never survive in the desert's harsh environment. The time was approaching when they would need to separate the family Sierra had created, a decision that weighed heavily on everyone involved. Rebecca raised the issue during one of their daily observation sessions. "We need to start planning for separation. Scout needs to begin the rewilding process, learning to hunt live prey and reducing human contact. Callie needs to be socialized for eventual adoption into a domestic home, and Sierra needs to prepare for release back to her territory." Elena had been dreading this conversation, though she knew it was inevitable. How do we do this without traumatizing all three of them? Sierra has invested months of maternal care into both kittens. Simply removing Callie could trigger depression or anxiety responses that might impact her ability to complete Scout's education. They developed a gradual separation protocol, starting with brief periods where Callie was removed from the enclosure for socialization training with humans. Sierra showed distress initially, pacing and calling for the missing kitten, but Scout's presence seemed to anchor her. The biological bond with her own offspring provided continuity even as the adopted bond was slowly weakened. Callie adapted to the separation surprisingly well, her domestic cat genetics making her naturally more comfortable with human interaction than Scout would ever be. The little calico transformed from a near-death desert foundling into a confident, playful young cat who eagerly sought attention from the staff. A family who had followed the story through media coverage applied to adopt Callie, and after thorough screening, Rebecca approved the placement. The day Callie left the rehabilitation center, Elena made sure Sierra could not see the transport. They had increased the separation time gradually over 3 weeks, and Sierra's attention had shifted more fully to Scout as the young bobcat's demands for hunting instruction and play intensified. But Elena still felt a pang of guilt as she watched Callie leave in her carrier, headed for a comfortable domestic life that the kitten's brief time with Sierra had made possible. Scout's development into an independent bobcat proceeded smoothly over the following months. Sierra taught her biological kitten all the skills necessary for desert survival: stalking techniques, prey selection, territorial marking, and most importantly, appropriate wariness of humans. By the time Scout was 6 months old, mother and kitten were hunting live prey released into the enclosure with impressive efficiency. The release back into the wild happened on a cool morning in late October, 8 months after that scorching June day when Sierra had first found Callie. Elena and Rebecca transported both bobcats to Sierra's original territory, carefully selecting a site with abundant prey and water access. The transport crates were positioned near rock formations, similar to where Sierra had defended Callie from the coyotes, bringing the story full circle. Sierra emerged from her crate first, testing the air with obvious recognition. This was her home territory, her landscape. Scout followed, staying close to her mother as they had practiced during pre-release conditioning. Together they moved into the desert, Sierra leading and Scout following, a young bobcat learning to navigate the world where she belonged. Elena watched them disappear into the landscape, binoculars tracking their movements until distance and terrain made observation impossible. She thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, about the small domestic kitten, that had catalyzed such extraordinary events, about the pregnant bobcat, whose maternal instinct had proven flexible enough to embrace the unexpected. The scientific papers Elena published in the following year generated significant discussion about animal cognition, maternal behavior, and the complex ways that hormones and environment could shape instinctive responses. Her work contributed to refined protocols for wildlife rehabilitation and expanded understanding of when and how human intervention in natural processes could be beneficial rather than harmful. But beyond the academic impact, Sierra's story resonated on a deeper level with everyone who heard it. In a world that often seemed divided between cold natural selection and sentimental anthropomorphism, Sierra had demonstrated something more nuanced. She had shown that maternal instinct, that drive to protect and nurture, could adapt and expand in ways that defied easy categorization as either purely biological or learned behavior. Callie thrived in her adoptive home, growing into a beautiful adult cat whose early desert ordeal left no visible scars. Her new family sent regular updates to the rehabilitation center, photos of a happy domestic cat living the comfortable indoor life she was bred for. Sometimes Elena would look at those photos and wonder if Callie retained any memory of her time with Sierra, of the spotted mother who had fought coyotes to protect her. Months after the release, Elena's remote cameras occasionally captured images of Sierra and Scout, now hunting independently, but still crossing paths in overlapping territories. Sierra had moved on with her life, her remarkable fostering of a domestic kitten, just one chapter in a longer story of survival and adaptation. But for Elena, for everyone at the rehabilitation center, and for the thousands of people who had followed the story, Sierra's actions would remain a powerful reminder that nature was far more complex and compassionate than simple models of survival could explain. In protecting one small kitten from certain death, Sierra had revealed something profound about the capacity for care that existed in the wild world, waiting for the right circumstances to flourish in unexpected and extraordinary ways.